Evet, iyi akşamlar. Bilim Akademisi'nin değerli üyeleri, değerli konuklar, Bilim Akademisi'nin dostları. Bu akşam yılın konferansına katıldığınız için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bizi yalnız bırakmadığınız için de çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ben toplantının başlangıcında bir miktar Bilim Akademisi'nin yaptığı son yayından, depremle ilgili yaptığımız 2 tane aktiviteden ve bunların da ortaya çıkardığı 2 kitaptan bahsederek başlayacağım. Ya biliyorsunuz 6 Şubat depremleri bizim için çok yıkıcı bir deprem süreci oldu. Bu süreçte Bilim Akademisi olarak kendimizi tabii sorumlu hissederek bir depremle ilgili bir koordinasyon kurulu kurduk. Bilim Akademisi'nin üyeleri Aydın Alatan'ın koordinatörlüğünde Naci Görür, Ersin Kalaycıoğlu, Sibel Salman, Canan Atılgan ve Ali Alpar'dan oluşan bir koordinasyon kurulumuz. Yapabileceklerimizi koordine etmek ve bunu kamuoyuyla paylaşmak için hızla çalışmaya başladılar ve aslında 4 tane önemli panel gerçekleştirdik. Depremin bütün yönleriyle tartışılmasını sağlayan hem işin jeolojisinden başlayıp işte politikasına, sağlık konusundaki sağlık politikalarına varıncaya kadar tüm konuları burada almaya çalıştık, dikkate almaya çalıştık. Ve ardından da bir önemli çalıştay gerçekleştirdik. Acaba ne tür araştırma çağrılarına çıkılsa ülkemizde özellikle de multidisipliner alanda ne tür araştırmalar yapılabilir? Bunu bu konuda bağış yapmak isteyen, katkı yapmak isteyen sivil topluma ithaf ederek bir çalışma içine girdik ve çok değerli olduğuna inandığım oldukça da önemli sayıda araştırma çağrısı önerisi hazırladık ki bunlar da tabii sadece birer çalıştayda kalabilecek tipte şeyler değildi. Bunun daha yaygın bir yayılımı için kitap haline getirilmesi gerekiyordu. Bunu da çok özenli bir çalışmayla kitaptaki tasarımı Deniz Cem Önduygu çok yetenekli bir grafik sanatçısı aynı zamanda kendisi. Onun tasarımlarıyla bu arada da görmüşsünüzdür. Geçen tanıtım filmimizde olduğu gibi temiz ve çok güzel bir kitap serimiz oldu. Bunu Bank ABC'nin katkısıyla yaptık ve Bank ABC'ye de bu konuda çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Diğeri de tabii bu çalışmanın içinde ortaya çıkan bir başka önemli bizim için de kolaylık yaratan konu depremle ilgili yerel yönetimlere ve belki de bu işlerle uğraşmak isteyen kişilere bir yol haritası olabilecek afetlere karşı belediyelerin ve şehirleşmemizin özellikle şehirlerdeki yıkım dikkate alınınca daha kolay katlanılabilir hale gelmesini sağlayacak bir yol haritası kitabı hazırlama fikri Naci Hocamızdan geldi ve Naci Hocamız da yine birçok önemli kendi alanındaki araştırmacılarla birlikte çok değerli bir deprem kitabı yayınladı ki bunu da biz bir yol haritası kitabı aslında bu. Bunu da Vehbi Koç Vakfı destekledi. Bu 2 kuruluşa da hem Bank ABC'ye hem de Vehbi Koç Vakfı'na son derece teşekkür ediyoruz. Çok değerli bir destek oldu. Biz de o desteğe layık olacak bir kitap yaptığımızı düşünüyorum. Hem baskısıyla hem içeriğiyle hem de bu acılı süreçte en azından bize daha güzel bir gelecek vaat edebilecek ve bilimin de Türkiye'de aslında refahın oluşmasında bir katkı yapan önemli bir bileşen olduğunu hatırlatacak bir çalışma oldu. Ya şunu ben tekrar vurgulamak isterim. Bilim refahın bir oluşturucu faktörüdür. Türkiye'de bu pek iyi algılanmıyor. Yani bilimi sadece akademilerde profesör ya da doçent olmak için yapılan şey gibi algılıyoruz ki ben onun çok yanlış olduğunu düşünüyorum. Normalde bilim aslında ürettikleriyle bizim refahımızı sağlayan şey. Şu anda kullandığımız her şey aslında bilimsel bir araştırmanın ürünü. Bu bağlantıyı bizim daha sık kurabiliyor olmamız lazım. Bunu da Bilim Akademisi olarak kamuoyuyla özellikle de popüler bilim alanında daha da yaygınlaştırarak bir toplumsal duyarlılık yaratmayı istiyoruz. Bu konuda Ben çalışma yapan bütün arkadaşlarımıza, özellikle de Bilim Akademisi ofisinde çalışan, gerçekten çok özveriyle çalışan arkadaşlarımıza çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bu kısa girişten sonra bugünün önemli konusu olan yılın konferansına geçeceğim. Yılın konferansı serisi bizim Bilim Akademisi olarak her yıl yaptığımız ve de kendi alanlarında önemli ve bize katkı yapacak derken bilimin herhangi bir alanda herhangi bir şekilde katkı yapacak olması bizim için yeterlidir yani bu anlamda. Fakat tabii daha sıcak ve güncel konuları seçmeye gayret ederek bunu yapıyoruz. Geçen yıl mesela Robin Cunningham gelmişti ve bize deprem sonrasında yıkılan arkeolojik değerlerin yeniden ayağa kaldırılması konusunda çok değerli bir geri bildirimde bulunmuştu. Bu yılki konumuz ise Profesör John Jost. Şimdi onu davet ettiğimiz için ve konuşması da İngilizce olacağı için bundan sonrasını İngilizce olarak devam edeceğim. Profesör John Jost bir tekrar ikinci slide alabilir. Evet. He is from New York University, actually the co-director of the Center for Social and Political Behavior and also the director for the Social Justice Lab. He is graduated from Duke University with a Bachelor in Arts degree in Psychology and Human Development, then moved to Yale University and get a PhD degree in Social and Political Psychology from Yale University. And he's been in the forefront of political science and political sociology research ever since. He's a very important researcher contributing to the field dealing with stereotyping, prejudice, intergroup relations, political ideology, social justice, social media usage, and system justification theories. So these are those very hot topics that everyone on the street, actually, even the layman, has an idea basically. But he will bridge this with the serious science, with very hardcore science, and I think you will enjoy his talk about this development. And he also wrote a number of articles, very productive researcher. Among the 6 books that he published, I think A Theory of System Justification, and just recently, The Left and Right, The Psychological Significance of Political Distinction. These 2 books that he mentioned that he has a very, I would say, deep in the heart. I guess that's the best books that he wrote, I guess, because he already got 2 important awards. One is a finalist for Prose Award, and the other one is Juliet and Alexander George Outstanding Political Psychology Book Award, just recently in 2021. So he's a member of many important societies. He got a number of very important awards, including Gordon Allport, Erik Erikson, Society for Personality and Social Psychology, Theoretical Innovation Prize, Society of Experimental Social Psychology, Career Trajectory Award, and many others. These are only the some samples that I just put in here, and also received several honorary doctorates, University of Buenos Aires and Edward Loránd University in Budapest, Hungary. So, Professor John Jost, now I introduce you, and the stage is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much. Hello. Thank you so much, Mr. President, or Dr. President. I guess. It's really wonderful to be here with you. Thank you all for being here and being so warm and wonderful. Already having a terrific time. So thank you. And this is a true honor and a true pleasure for me, really, to be here. So thank you. This is my second visit to Istanbul, and I find it to be one of the most beautiful cities in the world. So I'm really happy to be back. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C., which is not nearly as beautiful as Istanbul, but I was happy to be there too because I was being inducted into the American Academy of Political and Social Science. And as part of the ceremony, I and 6 other new inductees from all of the social sciences were asked to comment on the question of whether the so-called American experiment in democracy was in decline. All 7 of us concluded that yes, indeed, democracy in the U.S. is very much in jeopardy. The problems are myriad and complex, and they involve what I refer to as top-down and bottom-up processes and their interaction. Top-down processes refer to macro, structural, or institutional factors, including elite discourse and mass media, whereas bottom-up processes are more micro or social psychological, encompassing the needs, interests, and motivational concerns of individuals and social groups. In my view, these 2 types of processes are necessarily intertwined. Top-down characteristics of the overarching social system shape and elicit bottom-up psychological needs and motives, as well as group norms and local cultures. And conversely, the long-term viability of social systems depends upon their compatibility with psychological states. If people's needs are not met, the social system will eventually become unstable. And I think this is what happened in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, for instance. Right now, I do believe that the system of liberal democracy in the US and elsewhere is unstable and under threat, and the reasons are material and ideological, structural and psychological. Or, if you like economic metaphors, we can say that the market for ideology is always a function of supply and demand. Political elites make ideological offers, which ordinary citizens can accept or reject. But the elites are also responding to consumer demand. I'm not a political economist, but I see that many working people are frustrated and angry because they're working as hard as ever, but are not sharing proportionately in the fruits of their productivity. The actual sources of their frustration, I believe, have to do with global capitalism, but the far right has once again sought to place the blame on foreigners, immigrants, leftists, racial and sexual minorities, and so on. This has happened repeatedly throughout history, and it's happening again now. Right-wing authoritarianism has been selling in the US and many other countries. It seems to me that the so-called conservative right has defected when it comes to liberal democracy, and as in a prisoner's dilemma situation, the liberal left keeps trying to cooperate and keeps losing. But liberal leftists in the US really have no other choice. At this moment in time, as President Trump returns to office determined to crush any opposition, it's the blue states that will have to keep the flame of liberal democracy burning in the US. And illiberal democracy is an oxymoron. Even Viktor Orban of Hungary understands this. In terms of my own field of personality and social psychology, I believe that most, if not all of this, was predictable. Because the social, cognitive, and motivational differences between the liberal left and the conservative right are in fact very closely tied to the acceptance versus rejection of core democratic values and principles. These differences, which I discuss at length in my book, Left and Right, pertain to values such as equality versus hierarchy, progress versus tradition for the sake of tradition, civil liberty versus authority and social order, tolerance versus intolerance, diversity versus conformity, cooperation versus competition, and generalized empathy versus ostracism and victim blaming. These are some of the reasons why I believe that the future of democracy depends upon the values generally upheld by liberal leftists, but there are many other reasons as well. To state the obvious, last month, over 77 million Americans voted to re-elect a convicted sex offender, a man with 34 felonies to his name, a long, well-documented history of vulgarity and prejudice, a businessman who breaks all the rules and rarely even pays his own bills. We're talking about someone who refers to violent insurrectionists, including neo-fascists like the Proud Boys, as patriots and as hostages of the government, and who vowed to be a dictator on day one. These 77 million Americans, most of whom would describe themselves as conservative, voted for Donald Trump after a shameful campaign in which he made a mockery of American democracy, falsely claiming, for instance, that Haitian immigrants were eating their neighbors' pets, musing about having a firing squad execute former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, threatening to imprison Joe Biden and the so-called Biden crime family, and attacking the mainstream news media as the enemy of the people. These are classic displays of authoritarianism, right out of the authoritarian personality. Now, I'm hardly naive about American politics, but this is not something that I ever thought I would witness from a major presidential candidate in the United States, let alone a successful candidate. Unfortunately, the U.S. is not the only country in which democracy is in decline. The Economist, as you probably know, evaluates the state of democracy in every country on an annual basis, taking into account elections, civil liberties, citizen participation in politics, and quality of government. According to their expert estimates, democracy has deteriorated over the last decade in the US, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Austria, Belgium, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Croatia, Australia, Israel, and Turkey. Many people, myself included, are worried about the future of democracy all over the world. I want to focus today on two broad classes of threats to democracy, which feature prominently in political analyses, including the two best-selling books shown here. The first type of threat may be thought of as epistemic in nature. It has to do with the rejection of reason, an open embrace of irrationality in some quarters, and the triumph of falsehoods over truths, including inconvenient truths about anthropogenic climate change, all of which has been made far more dangerous by the internet and the proliferation of social media platforms. The second type of threat is more relational because it has to do with how citizens treat one another, and it's also existential because it's rooted in fear, aggression, and violent impulses. In this presentation, I want to link top-down political developments to bottom-up psychological factors. I'll first discuss ideological differences in the spread of misinformation, disinformation, and other epistemic threats to reason and democracy. I will suggest that, in essence, conservative psychological vulnerabilities are being exploited by right-wing politicians backed by powerful corporate actors. After that, I'll turn to ideological differences in authoritarianism, social dominance, willingness to defect from democratic principles, and support for political violence. Again, conservative vulnerabilities are increasingly exploited and channeled in an authoritarian direction. Finally, I'll suggest that the future of democracy depends upon the survival of interests, values, and psychological capabilities most often possessed by liberal leftists, not conservative rightists, and not illiberal leftists like Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela either. Returning for a moment to the recent US election, there's reason to believe that misinformation and disinformation played a major role. I saw it playing out even in my own social media networks, where I was powerless to convince friends of friends and distant relatives that they were spreading false news. According to an Ipsos Reuters poll that was conducted just 3 or 4 weeks before the election, more than 80% of people who consumed conservative media, such as Fox News, held false beliefs about major campaign issues pertaining to immigration, crime, and the economy. Moreover, citizens who subscribed to these false beliefs were overwhelmingly more likely to prefer Donald Trump, whereas people who held true beliefs were overwhelmingly more likely to prefer Kamala Harris. In many ways, it looks as if political falsehoods are winning out over the truth, and the blame for that is not evenly distributed across the population of candidates or voters. This is a huge problem because democracy needs reason and reason needs democracy. That is, democracy, like science, depends upon and fosters a commitment to reason and evidence. The founder of modern social psychology, Kurt Lewin, understood all of this very well, having been forced to flee Nazi Germany for the United States. To believe in reason means to believe in democracy, this is Kurt Lewin writing now, because it grants the reasoning partners a status of equality. It is therefore not an accident that not until the rise of democracy at the time of the American and French revolutions was the goddess of reason enthroned in modern society. And again, it is not accident that the first act of modern fascism in every country has been officially and vigorously to dethrone this goddess and instead to make emotions and obedience the all-ruling principles in education and life from kindergarten to death. Lewin's vision makes clear that social science has a huge role to play in keeping democratic societies honest. And this also helps to explain why social science is always under attack in authoritarian societies. Despite the potential risks, I do believe that in light of recent political developments, social scientists should be asking difficult questions about the future of democracy, including the question of whether liberal leftists are more committed to reason and, relatedly, scientific and democratic principles. When I try to answer these questions for myself, I'm confronted with mounting empirical evidence from personality and social psychology and neighboring fields that yes, compared to conservative rightists and others, liberal leftists are indeed significantly higher in the need for cognition and integrative complexity, lower in dogmatism and closed-mindedness, less likely to view and share fake news and dubious information, less likely to accept ideologically congenial information at face value, and better at distinguishing between true and false information. We can also, and I think should also, ask whether liberal leftists are more capable of deliberative, sound reasoning. In answering this question, we need to familiarize ourselves with research, which I will summarize, indicating that, compared to others, liberal leftists are more likely to engage in the rational updating of beliefs in light of informational corrections, and better at truth discernment even under conditions that incentivize accuracy. Liberal leftists also tend to perform better on objective tests of cognitive abilities and are more likely to engage in cognitive reflection and analytic thinking. And finally, give more epistemic credence to science and evidence and less to intuition. 40 years ago, social psychologists came up with an individual difference measure to distinguish between people who are inclined to think deeply and to enjoy doing so, and those who do not. They called this the need for cognition scale, and use self-report items, such as the two sample items shown here. So basically, research participants are presented with a list of statements and asked to rate how much they agree or disagree with each of these statements on some continuous scale. The two sample items here are: the notion of thinking abstractly is appealing to me, and I usually end up deliberating about issues even when they do not affect me personally. Although the creators of this scale had no particular interest in political psychology, it turns out that liberal leftists scored higher than conservative rightists in all 16 studies I could find, with 12 of these comparisons reaching conventional levels of statistical significance and an overall meta-analytic effect size that should be taken seriously. Ideological differences are even more pronounced on measures of integrative complexity, operationalized in terms of the willingness and capacity to recognize and reconcile seemingly conflicting perspectives or arguments. It's basically the opposite of black and white thinking. It's a tendency to see and appreciate different shades of gray. According to a quantitative meta-analysis of 26 studies based on over 7,000 participants from the US, UK, and Sweden, my colleagues and I found that liberal leftists score higher on both subjective and objective measures of integrative complexity and cognitive flexibility. Finally, there have been at least 50 studies of ideological asymmetries in dogmatism and closed-mindedness, measured in terms of agreement with items such as these. I'm absolutely certain my ideas about fundamental issues in life are correct, and to compromise with our political opponents is dangerous because it usually leads to the betrayal of our own side. When we combine the results of 12,000 participants from 7 different countries in North America and Europe, we find that conservative rightists and religious fundamentalists score much higher on scales of dogmatism and closed-mindedness. Now, so far I've shown you evidence pertaining to psychological variables, most but not all of which are based upon verbal self-report measures. It's at least conceivable that liberal leftists and conservative rightists differ merely in terms of their self-conceptions or abstract ambitions, but these differences have no major consequences for behavior in the real world. However, this is not what large-scale observational studies of behavior on social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter show. On the contrary, the concrete behavioral differences observed in the wild, so to speak, closely mirror the more abstract psychological differences I've described in terms of self-reported epistemic motives and abilities. Let me tell you briefly about the results of 8 or so observational studies. These are not cherry-picked. They faithfully represent what social media researchers have found when they have looked carefully. One relatively early study conducted during the 2016 US presidential campaign focused on the sharing of fake news on Facebook. Researchers first surveyed a nationally representative sample of 3,500 US adults and gained permission to access their Facebook accounts. They discovered that self-identified political conservatives were 15 times more likely than liberals to share links from fake news domains on Facebook. Think about that for a minute. 15 times more likely. It's a huge difference, one that we're not accustomed to seeing in science. Moreover, people who describe themselves as very conservative were 10 times more likely than those who describe themselves as very liberal to share fake news. So this is not just about ideological extremity in general. There is an unmistakable directional difference. In another impressively large study, the same group of researchers harvested 1.3 billion Facebook posts in 2018 and used a third-party service to classify the media sources that were shared as low versus high in credibility. They discovered that very conservative Facebook users were 6 times more likely to view low credibility articles that were ideologically congruent and 3 times more likely to share these low credibility articles with their friends compared to very liberal Facebook users. A different group of researchers tracked more than 16,000 Twitter accounts in 2016 and found that 11% of center-rightists and 21% of extreme rightists shared stories from untrustworthy websites that published fabricated stories, questionable claims, and outright falsehoods, compared to less than 5% of centrists and leftists. An ideological asymmetry in attitudes and behaviors concerning fact-checking websites was observed as long ago as 2012. This study found that 74% of the people who used fact-checking websites were Democrats, and less than 10% of them were Republicans. The researchers also examined online hostility against fact-checkers and found that on a proportional basis, Republicans were more likely to use social media platforms to criticize and attack fact-checkers. An analysis of social media diets in 2016 found that the average person's informational ecosystem was 7.6 times more likely to include news articles from untrustworthy conservative versus untrustworthy liberal websites. And many other studies find that social media feeds and informational networks of conservatives are much more likely than average to contain false information from dubious sources. There's a very real sense in which conservative rightists are disproportionate victims of the online misinformation industry. At the same time, I'm proposing that their own epistemic habits and proclivities make them especially vulnerable to politically motivated lies and distortions. Behavioral scientists also studied the spread of misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic, harvesting 3.5 million tweets on the subject. They found that although highly influential liberals on Twitter were more likely to share public health information in general, highly influential conservatives were twice as likely to spread COVID misinformation and false conspiracy theories, such as claims that Bill Gates was responsible for the virus and touting false cures for the disease. Epidemiology studies suggest that Americans who lived in heavily pro-Trump areas were nearly 3 times as likely to die from COVID after the vaccine became available compared to people who lived in heavily pro-Biden areas, adjusting for other factors. I think you can make the case that ideology kills, quite literally. In addition to all the naturalistic observational studies I've described, there are experimental studies which provide the strongest evidence for ideological asymmetries in epistemic virtues and vices. In one such experiment, a nationally representative sample of 1,200 Americans were exposed to 20 news stories, 10 true and 10 false stories, every 2 weeks over the course of 12 waves of a panel repeated study. So there were different news stories every 2 weeks for a total of 24 weeks that they were exposed to. Results revealed that conservatives were more credulous overall and less able to distinguish between true and false claims. Moreover, very conservative respondents were 3 times more likely than very liberal respondents to accept false claims as true. Another experiment is noteworthy because a large number of true and false Google News articles, 80 of them altogether, were randomly sampled and presented to U.S. participants in 2020. Once again, liberals were significantly better at distinguishing between true and false news articles. Extreme conservatives were the least truth-discerning group, whereas extreme liberals were most truth-discerning. There's also parallel evidence from the UK and Germany that liberal leftists in those countries are also better at truth discernment than conservative rightists. In another experiment, Democrats and Republicans were exposed to real and fake news headlines that were ideologically congruent or incongruent and asked whether they believed or rejected them. Subsequently, signal detection analyses were used to identify hits or correct acceptances and false alarms, incorrect acceptances, as well as correct and incorrect rejections as a function of ideological congruence. Results revealed that Republicans exhibited significantly more partisan bias than Democrats. Specifically, they were more likely to accept fake news if it was ideologically congruent and to reject real news if it was ideologically incongruent. That is, they used ideologically biased thresholds when it comes to belief acceptance. There are a smattering of studies using various informational feedback and belief updating tasks suggesting that liberal leftists are more likely than conservative rightists to update their political and non-political beliefs in a manner that's consistent with Bayesian rationality. An especially comprehensive investigation made use of 8 panel experiments involving over 17,000 respondents who were exposed to widely disseminated true and false news stories and asked whether they believed them both before and after exposure to fact-checking interventions. Some of the articles were again congenial to the political right and others were congenial to the left. Prior to correction, Republicans were more likely than Democrats to believe all 12 of the false statements that were congenial to the right wing, whereas Democrats were more likely than Republicans to believe only 2 of the 9 false statements that were congenial to the left wing. When they were corrected about false ideologically congenial claims, Democrats updated their beliefs significantly more than Republicans, exhibiting counter-attitudinal persuasion. So Democrats changed their minds in light of the evidence more than Republicans. In 4 experiments, over 3,000 participants were instructed to distinguish between true and false news headlines in the presence or absence of financial incentives for accuracy. So basically, the research participants were paid more if they answered correctly. So some headlines were, again, right congenial, whereas others were left congenial. In the control condition, liberals were 2.3 times better than conservatives at distinguishing between true and false headlines in general, and conservatives were 2.2 times more likely to exhibit partisan bias by accepting false, ideologically congruent information and rejecting true, ideologically incongruent information. With financial incentives in place, the ideological gap closed very slightly, but liberals were still 1.6 times better at truth discernment, and conservatives were still 2.3 times more likely to exhibit partisan bias. The fact that conservatives were less accurate and more biased, even under conditions that incentivized accuracy, suggests that there may be ideological differences in epistemic abilities as well as epistemic motives. So we can ask, are liberal leftists more capable of sound reasoning, which, according to many normative theories in political science, is a prerequisite for democratic decision-making to work? There's accumulating evidence that liberal leftists tend to perform better on objective tests of cognitive abilities. So one longitudinal study followed over 7,000 British children born in 1970 and found that children who scored higher on tests of verbal and nonverbal ability at age 10 were more likely to hold liberal attitudes at age 30, statistically adjusting for many other factors. Several other studies conducted in the US, UK, Germany, and Australia have found that liberal leftists score higher than conservative rightists on a wide variety of measures of general intelligence and both verbal and nonverbal cognitive abilities, even after adjusting statistically for levels of education and socioeconomic status. Researchers have devised a simple 3-item measure of cognitive reflection, which combines epistemic motivation, or the desire to think deeply about problems, and cognitive abilities, such as intelligence and rationality. Participants are asked 3 questions, including this one. You ready? If it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? For each question, there's an intuitive, attractive, and seemingly simple, but ultimately false solution. In this case, most people say that it would take 100 minutes, but that's wrong. The correct answer is actually 5 minutes. If you got this question right, you are high in cognitive reflection. Congratulations. In general, liberal leftists tend to do at least a bit better than other people on this cognitive reflection test. When I was conducting research for my book, I was able to find 12 studies, including one conducted here in Turkey by Onurcan Yilmaz and Adil Serbe, who are here tonight, and I thank them for being here. Overall, we can conclude from meta-analyses that conservative rightists and religious fundamentalists score lower in cognitive reflection and analytic versus intuitive thinking. And other studies suggest that this lack of cognitive reflection renders them more susceptible to fake news. Consistent with all of the ideological differences in epistemic motives and standards that I've been telling you about, many studies have found that conservatives, authoritarians, and religious people in the US and Europe are significantly more likely than others to hold attitudes that are unfavorable to science and scientists. Moreover, we find that these ideological factors are even more important than education and socioeconomic status in predicting anti-scientific attitudes, including cynicism about the motives and training of scientists. A PhD dissertation at the University of Amsterdam by Vukašin Gligoric has found that conservative rightists in the US and the Netherlands are more distrusting of scientists in over 30 different fields, ranging from environmental scientists and virologists to food scientists, psychologists, astrophysicists, chemists, botanists, neuroscientists, and biologists. Even more disturbing, conservative rightists are less likely to disapprove of the harassment of scientists, which can take the form of insults and physical intimidation and even death threats. Rightists were less willing than leftists to sign a petition calling for an end to the harassment of scientists, which has indeed become a serious problem in many countries over the last few years, especially since COVID. To the extent that democracy depends upon citizens' abilities and willingness to update their beliefs in a rational and truthful manner, all the findings I've described and many others in the literature suggest that we're in deep trouble. One would hope that politicians would take note and seek to stop the spread of false information and online harassment in the name of democracy. Instead, conservative politicians in the US have pressured social media companies to stop trying to fight misinformation. And rather than taking action to improve the quality of information to which Americans are exposed, they've sent legal subpoenas and threatening letters to social scientists at my university and others who, in the name of democracy and reason, have been tracking the spread of political misinformation and disinformation. One of the two major parties, in other words, appears to have officially sided with misinformation and apparently abandoned any commitment to the truth whatsoever. This is epistemic violence at the highest level of government. Unfortunately, our problems are not confined to epistemic matters. They're also relational and existential. The times require us to ask, are liberal leftists more committed to democracy itself? When we look at empirical evidence, we find that compared to conservative rightists, liberal leftists are indeed lower in authoritarian aggression and group-based dominance, less likely to defect from democratic norms and more supportive of political equality, less supportive of blatantly anti-democratic candidates, and less likely to support or commit political violence. Two obvious cases in recent memory illustrate the problem. First, there was President Trump's baseless accusations of voter fraud that led to the violent insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. And then 2 years later, a very similar event occurred in Brazil with supporters of Jair Bolsonaro, some of whom were reportedly making Nazi salutes, refusing to concede the election. Social and personality psychologists have found that in all US presidential elections going back to Kennedy versus Nixon in 1960, Republican voters have scored higher than Democratic voters on various measures of authoritarianism. In a nationally representative sample of primary voters in 2016, my colleagues and I found that conservative voters, and Trump supporters in particular, were especially likely to endorse statements reflecting authoritarian aggression, such as, "What our country needs instead of more civil rights is a good stiff dose of law and order," and "What our country really needs is a strong, determined president who will crush the evil and set us in our right way again." They were also especially likely to endorse statements reflecting group-based dominance, such as some groups of people are simply inferior to other groups, and some groups of people must be kept in their place. Deborah Oliveira dos Santos and I analyzed data from a nationally representative survey of Americans in the fall of 2022, conducted along with the organizations shown here. Once again, we observed strong correlations between conservatism and authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. We also measured what political scientists referred to as defection from the democratic rules of the game, and found that conservative rightists were significantly more likely to endorse these three items. I don't mind a politician's method if they manage to get the right things done. The main trouble with democracy is that most people don't really know what's best for them, and the true American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. On the other hand, liberal leftists were much more likely to endorse political equality, agreeing that everyone should be allowed to vote, voting should be easy, and laws need to protect minority groups when society makes them vulnerable. Liberal leftists were also more supportive of legal rights and guarantees, agreeing that the law should treat everyone the same, regardless of wealth or power, that the president should not be above the law, and that men and women should have the same legal rights and protections. We also asked survey respondents if they would vote for a hypothetical candidate from their own party who made blatantly anti-democratic statements, such as these: "My opponent is so dangerous that they deserve to go to jail. If I lose this election, it's only because the system is rigged. I will never concede defeat to my opponent. And I don't care if the courts say this election is legitimate. I will decide whether to accept the results or not." Sadly, we found that conservative rightists were much more likely than liberal leftists to support such a candidate. We also obtained evidence of statistical mediation, such that authoritarianism helped to explain why conservatives were more likely to defect from the democratic rules of the game, and group-based dominance helped to explain why conservatives were less supportive of political equality and legal rights and guarantees, and why they were willing to vote for a blatantly anti-democratic candidate. We also found in this same study that conservative rightists were slightly more supportive of political violence, measured in terms of endorsement of these two items. "I support the use of violence to ensure my party's candidate wins the 2024 presidential election, and I would personally be willing to use violence to ensure that my party's candidate wins the 2024 presidential election." Unfortunately, as we know, political violence is not merely hypothetical in the US and elsewhere. The Anti-Defamation League is an organization that systematically tracks violence planned and committed by left-wing extremists, including groups and movements traditionally considered parts of the far left, including anarchists and environmental and animal rights activists, as well as right-wing extremists, including white supremacists, neo-Nazis, the alt-right, racist skinheads, some members of Christian Identity and Patriot militia, tax protest, and anti-governmental survivalist movements. According to their searchable database, in 2023, there were 8,652 aggressive and violent incidents committed by people with ties to right-wing extremism in the US. 8,652. That's over 23 incidents per day. How many attacks do you suppose were committed by left-wing extremists in the United States in 2023? The answer is 1, and no one died from it. In 2022 and 2023, every single politically motivated murder committed in the U.S. was committed by someone with a right-wing connection. 100%. But let's expand our comparison to cover a longer period of time. Between 2002, the first year in which data is provided by the Anti-Defamation League, and 2023, there were 33,090 violent incidents linked to the far right, compared to 57 incidents linked to the far left. That's a ratio of 580 to 1. During the same time period, there were 328 politically motivated murders committed by right-wingers, compared to 9 politically motivated murders committed by left-wingers, for a ratio of 36 to 1. A separate study analyzed over 1,500 individuals who engaged in political violence in the U.S. between 1948 and 2018. These researchers observed that most violent activities, including successful and unsuccessful attempts to kill or harm people for political reasons, were committed by either right-wing or Islamist extremists. There were no differences between these two extremist groups in terms of number of attacks. Compared to these groups, individuals who adhered to a left-wing ideology had 68% lower odds of engaging in violent activities. The ideological asymmetry in terrorism and political violence is by no means confined to the United States. The same team of researchers also analyzed data from the Global Terrorism Database, focusing on more than 70,000 terrorist attacks carried out by over 500 ideologically motivated groups all over the world from 1970 to 2017. They found that Islamic and far-right attacks were far more lethal than far-left attacks. Specifically, left-wing terror attacks had 45% lower odds of resulting in 1 or more fatalities, compared to right-wing attacks, another sizable ideological asymmetry at the global level. Left-wing extremists, especially in the US but also in other countries, typically target and destroy or damage public and private property, which is bad enough. Right-wing extremists, on the other hand, are significantly more likely to target and kill human beings. Okay, time for some conclusions. The first thing I want to say is that I do not think that liberal leftists are perfect. I was raised by 2 of them, and so I know very well how imperfect they are. We're all human, all too human, as Nietzsche said, by which I mean that everyone is potentially susceptible to informational bias, irrationality, and bad behavior. We have prejudices, which we must confront, and we often do. Intellectual humility is important, and by the way, liberal leftists tend to exhibit more intellectual humility in general. There's abundant evidence, as I've shown, that liberal leftists are more committed to and more capable of deliberative reasoning, which is fundamental to democratic decision-making. Specifically, psychologists and other social scientists have demonstrated that liberal leftists are higher in epistemic motives for elaborated cognition, integrative complexity, cognitive reflection, and analytic thinking. They're lower in dogmatism and closed-mindedness. They're less likely to view and share dubious information and to accept false but ideologically congenial information. They're better at truth discernment and rational belief updating and more supportive of science and the need for evidence. Because liberal leftists are more committed to equality and social progress, as well as to reason, they're also more committed to democratic principles. Specifically, the evidence shows that liberal leftists are, in general, lower in authoritarian aggression and group-based dominance, less likely to defect from democratic norms, and more supportive of political equality and civil rights, less supportive of blatantly anti-democratic candidates, both hypothetical and real, and less likely to support or commit political violence. This is why the future of democracy is largely in the hands of the liberal left. I also think it's fair to say that here in Turkey and in the United States, and in many other countries as well, the liberal left has a much better historical record of promoting and maintaining democratic as opposed to anti-democratic values and standards. And so, among other things, I'm trying to explain from a social psychological perspective why all of this is the case. It may sound to you as if I believe that conservatives are somehow inherently stupid and immoral. That's not the case. That's not what I believe. I think that they're victims of bad faith ideology more than anything else. Conservatives have certain vulnerabilities that are more pronounced, perhaps, and that have been ruthlessly exploited by the powerful and the far right. The psychological differences themselves are not huge, but there are many of them, and virtually all of them have been exploited in American politics of late. Conservative ideology, especially far-right ideology, and the truth have been on a collision course for years. Rightists today subscribe to a belief system, a worldview, that is increasingly at odds with democracy and with reality. And that's why they're motivated to attack scientists, journalists, academics, and others who have the epistemic authority, at least in theory, to debunk ideological falsehoods and illuminate the truth. For my generation, probably the clearest example has to do with anthropogenic climate change. When the scientific evidence began to threaten the fossil fuel industry's grip on the capitalist economy, the evidence had to give way. Politicians on the right learned that gaslighting was a viable political strategy, even a winning one with their constituency. Now they can deny all sorts of things, including institutionalized racism, sexism, economic exploitation, and so on. But let's not end on such a pessimistic note, shall we? If the great Turkish writer Nazim Hikmet could maintain hope for a better society in the future, even from his prison cell, surely we can too. Here are his 5 lines. To overcome lies in the heart, in the streets, in the books, from the lullabies of the mothers, to the news report that the speaker reads. Understanding, my love, what a great joy it is to understand what is gone and what is on the way. I agree. What a great joy it is to understand, and what a responsibility, too. Surely, understanding is what we're aiming for in science, and it should also be what we're aiming for in our politics. It gives me joy to see how hard all of you are working for reason and democracy, and to understand that our challenges are, in many ways, the same. Thank you. Teşekkürler. I think we'll have some questions now, yeah? I know that was a bit heavy. We can lighten up now, I guess, for a little while, before we go back to work.
Thank you so much, John. It's an inspiring talk. Thank you very much. So I'll just moderate the questions. Just floor is yours. Any question to John? I think, yeah. Let's start from this.
Sure.
I'll be just moderating.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I am certainly convinced by all this detailed evidence you have provided. But I'm wondering what to do as a left-leaning individual who believes in democracy. Because there are difficulties for us, for Americans, and I suspect if somebody studied the evidence, and I'm sure some people did, in this country too, the outcomes would be very similar. Now, it seems to me this is, in a democratic system, how to proceed in face of this evidence is a very delicate matter. And I remember a leading American politician who called the conservative right-leaning people a basket of deplorables. And it badly misfired on her. So would you tell us a little bit about how we should proceed in a democratic system to protect democracy?
I agree 100% with everything you just said. I'm not going to suggest or pretend that I have all the answers to that question. I do think that the role of the scientist is different than the role of the politician. I don't think that either Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama should be the social scientist in chief and necessarily, make a campaign issue about the things that I'm talking about. But I honestly don't think that we in our society or in your society can even make any progress until we really understand the depth of the problem and the ways that it's playing out in the real world. And I think, for me, the only hope, the only type of solutions that I can imagine, because I am on the liberal left and not the illiberal left, is that we have to hold firm to democratic principles and to remind everyone that democracy only works in a context in which voters are well-informed, not misinformed, certainly not deliberately misinformed, that essentially the kind of behavior that has been going on is fundamentally undemocratic and has to be called out as such. By whom, I'm not exactly sure. I think this time around, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris alternated between trying to warn the American people about the threat to democracy that Donald Trump posed and trying to make light of it so as not to give him too much feelings of power, calling him weird and so on. It was kind of a mixed message. I think it got garbled. You can't say someone's a threat to the democracy and also just bizarre and strange. They tried different things. I think it's going to take a more extensive effort by more segments of civil society to take on the problems of both of informational misinformational abuse and abuse of social media, abuse of people's epistemic vulnerabilities, really, as well as holding people accountable for anti-democratic, especially violent behavior. Without doing that, we're not really a democracy. So I think if democracy means anything, it's that certain things are out of bounds, and those things are out of bounds. So who's the referee? I don't know. I think in a democracy, we all have to be the referee, right? In the middle there? Yeah. There's a microphone, I think, in the middle over here.
Hi, John. Thank you for the great talk. So I was wondering where you placed emotions and anger in particular, because I seem to remember that conservatives were more reactive in terms of physiological responses as well. And I was wondering where you placed anger in particular in terms of how it might decrease the cognitive complexities and all that sort of stuff. I was wondering where it fits into this narrative.
Well, yeah, as you probably know, the research literature on the relationship between emotion and cognition is very complicated. It's really mixed. I'm not sure we have a tremendous handle on it still after 40 years of working on it. But I do think anger is fundamental to the sort of second half of what I was talking about. Authoritarian aggression, social dominance orientation, blaming and scapegoating minority groups in society for all the problems of society, whipping up people's anger under the circumstances especially when they're frustrated. They're frustrated economically, perhaps they're frustrated culturally and symbolically as well. It's not hard, I think, to get people angry and to say, attack those people. But it is undemocratic, and it has to be called out again as undemocratic. That's not how we settle our differences and our problems in a democratic society. It has to also be considered, out of bounds. Thank you. There's several. Yeah. Oh, here too.
Thank you, John. Today there was an article in the British newspaper Guardian calling Elon Musk a one-man rogue state because of the way he altered Twitter's algorithm to favor Trump. So do you think that the social media or tech industry is destroying American democracy?
It's not helping. It's not helping. Yeah, Elon Musk is out of control. I mean, he's not an elected member of our government, and he's telling the Republicans to vote against the passing of the bipartisan budget bill. Who does this guy think he is? Well, he's a billionaire, and he's become best friends with Donald Trump. So that's also fundamentally an undemocratic situation, even before we talk about what he did with Twitter and the algorithms of X. Yeah, I don't know. I have friends who are a little bit more optimistic. I don't know, you got from my remarks that I'm not feeling especially optimistic, not since the election. But I do have friends who are optimistic that with regard to artificial intelligence, which is going to sweep through all of our societies any day now and create all kinds of cultural changes that are hard to predict. Some people think that they're starting to think about the ethics of AI and how to create laws, at least in the European Union. The European Union, I think, is better than the US at thinking ahead of time and putting laws in place. But one problem, I think, with the internet and social media is people didn't have those conversations about the ethics of this, and they created something that, by some lights, increases the possibility of democracy by allowing everyone to say what they think and express themselves in a public manner and so on. It has a great capacity for democratic deliberation. Again, if we could agree on some ground rules there and enforce them, it's not, I think, in fact, been helpful to our democracies. There's also, I didn't really mention this in my remarks, but there's also this problem of foreign governments acting to disrupt democratic societies in the West to create chaos and see democracy doesn't work as a way of justifying a more totalitarian system elsewhere. So we have big problems. That's what I'm here to say. We got big problems. We better start putting the best minds at work on the problem, like all of you in your country.
Let's get two more questions.
Two more questions, yeah. If you guys can stay, I can take more than two. Yeah. I'm happy. Yeah, I enjoy the back and forth, actually. That's why I'm here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yesterday, he made me take 20,000 steps, but it's good. My wife will be happy with that.
Thank you very much for the very great presentation. So I have a question. You said you're highly concerned about the victory of right-wing authoritarian conservative parties and so on, and how that threatens democracy. But so what about the claim that liberal leftists, with all their compassion and all these beautiful things, but they fall short in acknowledging the problems of the ordinary people, and there are serious issues right now, such as immigration and the causes, the problems caused by immigrants in some countries, and sometimes the issue about LGBT, like some claim that it may have gone too far, too extreme, like trans people going to the toilets of the other gender and so on. So what about the claim that liberal leftists, these are all problems for the ordinary people, but liberal leftists are so hypersensitive to talk about anything like that, to address people's concerns, and for political correctness, they don't talk about these things, they don't address people's daily, ordinary people's problems. So that's why people reacting against these things win. And these people are conservatives.
Okay, thanks for your question. Well, first of all, I don't think, I don't honestly believe that those are the real problems that people are actually affecting their lives. That someone is using a bathroom somewhere that you don't like them to use. I believe that's a subjective perception that has been created essentially through some mechanism that's akin to propaganda. I really do. Now, I also think that in a democratic society, we should all freely debate these things without attacking people for having certain opinions and so on. So I'm completely against the kind of cancel culture response to these things that sometimes does come from the left. I think that's also an example. It's not political violence. It's not a governmental insurrection, but it's also out of bounds in my view of what a liberal democracy is all about. We should be able to talk about these issues, but honestly, I think people's problems are also in some countries. I can't speak for every country's got a different situation, but there's no question that concerns about immigration in the United States were overblown, and that many people, 80% of the people who watch conservative news outlets were just wrong about the facts, about the numbers of immigrants, about the problem, the extent of the problem, and so on. In the United States, we've been a country of immigrants right from the very start. Unless you're Native American, you're an immigrant. I'm an American. My family was American immigrants on all sides. It's always been a country of immigrants, and the influx of immigrants now is not nearly as deeply concerning, certainly not to any experts, including economists, sociologists, etc. It's clearly a problem that's been amplified and misrepresented, is all I can say. I do sympathize with the fact that people are working harder and harder. Many people work 2 jobs, 3 jobs to pay the bills. If you look at the macroeconomic picture of the United States, economic productivity has been going up and up and up for like 4 decades. And the share that's going to relatively has gone down and down and down during that same period. I think the real problems people face are economic. They're not, I think, about someone who's crawling across the border somewhere or somebody who's using a bathroom over there. I think those are red herrings. Those are distractions, and it's intentional. It's intentional. Okay, lots more questions. This is great. I want to hear more. In the first row or second row down here. Okay.
Thank you so much for this nice speech. But I want conservative and liberals and came along, how and why they can't come together.
Well, yeah, I think right now is really hard. Having Trump as president is not going to help with that. I think at this moment, it's inevitable that there's going to be polarization and conflict in the United States. And there's one thing I would say, there's a lot of things about conflict and polarization that are potentially problematic. It's not potentially problematic, it's not necessarily problematic that people disagree about things, that there's actually ideological polarization or belief polarization or policy polarization. That's arguably healthy for a democracy to be debating these things and for the voters to have actual choice in the matter. The problem, of course, is especially when it turns violent, but even when it turns, really ugly in an interpersonal sense. That's the real problem. there is research, experimental interventions, how to reduce affective polarization and so on. I can point you to that literature about what people are finding works better than other things. But I also read an article in the last year that I found really interesting by two sociologists who kind of were arguing that anytime there's egalitarian progress, there is going to be increased polarization because of the backlash from the right. And so you've got a spate of killings by the police of African Americans, then you've got the Black Lives Matter movement, and inevitably there's going to be a reaction to that. And that polarization, they argue, is an inevitable consequence of the fact that one group is fighting for increased democratic rights for everybody, and another group is opposed to the expansion of those rights.
Hi. Thank you very much for your illuminating talk, and it made me feel very good as a member of a minority in an authoritarian society. Yeah. But I want to ask if you would speculate as to why this is so. And I know it wasn't the focus of your talk, yeah. But I mean, we don't want to be essentialists, so any explanations for why this is so?
Yeah, sometimes people think I'm making some kind of essentialist argument about conservative brains and liberal brains or something. It's not that. It's an argument I make in the book about it's called elective affinities is the concept, and it's a concept that I kind of taken from Max Weber. Max Weber took it from the German novelist Goethe, who wrote a book about elective affinities, comparing social relations to like chemical reactions. Like there's a chemical bond here, but then you introduce a new chemical, and they split, and a new molecule is formed here. You apply that to elites and ideologies, and mass publics. You can see that there are ways in which certain ideas are going to gravitate toward people with certain other kinds of inclinations and interests. And I think it's more a question of that. That, for instance, ideologies that are more like distortions, more like lies, farther away from the truth, are going to be more palatable to people with different kinds, lower kinds of epistemic standards, I think. So I think it's always going to be a problem. If we believe in democracy, and I do, there's going to be a range of peoples who are, sometimes they're called low information voters, who are either not interested in politics or not interested in intellectual subjects at all. It's a vulnerability for the population, for the democracy, that unless there are other guardrails in place, that false propaganda, fake news, conspiracy theories, and so on could find a home, and they found a home. So we got work to do as social scientists, as people who believe in democracy, not throw those people in jail, not kill them, but use powers of persuasion and democratic discourse to say, let's get back on track here. Let's actually solve some problems instead of creating craziness and chaos. Okay, now we got 10 more questions. Good. All right, good.
Up to 9.
Good.
7:30 is it okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's okay. Let's start with that. I don't know who is the. Yeah.
Okay.
The expert is waiting there.
Thank you for coming all the way up here and giving such a wonderful presentation. But it seems as if, though, as you mentioned at the beginning of your speech, that when we reduce the behaviors of such polarized groups into a game like Prisoner's Dilemma, the liberal leftists are cooperating. And they're losing, because why wouldn't they? They're competing against an opponent that is misguided, misinformed, selfish, and all the things that you just mentioned. So, but also you said that they are the victims, the conservative rights are the victims of a bad faith propaganda and bad faith ideology. So should we treat them as victims and stop cooperating? Or should we, what I'm trying to say is that, can we fight at them in the boundaries of democracy? Or is it democracy is already dead, for example, like the situation in Turkey? So we have to restore it by other means?
Good questions, deep questions. Again, it's probably going to have to be a situation-by-situation analysis, a country-by-country analysis, and so on. Do I think there's ever a place for forceful things? I guess. But only after you've tried everything else. I'm not going to advocate for that here or there at this moment. But fortunately, we're not merely in a prisoner's dilemma situation. In a prisoner's dilemma situation, you're in different cells, you can't communicate with the other person, so you can't coordinate. There's no opportunity to coordinate your choices. That's part of the problem why it's such a dilemma, right? So hopefully, theoretically, in a democracy, we do have that opportunity to discuss and come back to some kind of social coordination. I don't know how that's going to happen. I honestly think the Republicans, probably the hardcore Republicans, even the ones who are fighting with their more moderate Republicans in Congress, I don't think they're gonna really come to their senses and cooperate with Democrats. So they're going to have to lose their seats in Congress at some point. And the only way they're going to lose their seats in Congress is if the Republican Party loses elections. So I think, the answer to this question is political organization is the answer. Social organization. There's going to be 1 million postmortems of the last election in the U.S. Kamala Harris and the DNC had a lot of money. They spent a lot of it badly, it appears now. We need better politics, as well as from the top, as well as grassroots organization and things like this. But yeah, right, the situation's not good.
Okay, thank you. A very nice tour d'horizon so far as we're concerned. You've done quite a bit of what is popular nowadays, data mining. Thank you very much. But there are a few questions in my mind I'd like to ask you. One is that it looks as if some Democrats have also voted for Trump. Were they conservatives, or was there another factor in their voting behavior? That's one factor, of course. Another
Do you want me to answer that first, or you want to give me the string?
I'll give you the set of questions before I forget
All right, I'll try to remember them too.
before I forget them. Second point, I thought you were going to make more of a point of that, but you didn't, is about the role of education. Yeah. A lot of research also indicate that those who are educated seem to be supporting the Democrats, just like many other countries we know of, and those who are not so much educated seem to be supporting Republican, right-wing Republican political candidates across the board, not only Mr. Trump. So is this just a reflection of the education to a certain extent? And then there is another variable there, which is more, should we say, political sociology or political economy, matter of class. You also mentioned that. You know, Mr. Elon Musk is now acting as a political party by himself. He has just announced today that he's going to field some moderate Republican candidates in deep blue states and finance their campaigns so that those could be flipped over. So remaking the United States by buying votes. Now, that is not democracy, that's plutocracy. Yashka Monk has this book, I'm sure you're familiar with it, 2018 People versus Democracy, where he argues that the US has stopped being a democracy, but it's a liberal plutocracy. So it may even become a conservative plutocracy eventually by the likes of Mr. Musk. So is there a class base to all of this? Extremely rich, buying politicians and lawyers, especially Supreme Court judges, to ensure that their hegemony continues, versus lower classes who are, to a certain extent, also bought by them by different propaganda methods, etc. And that creates this current situation. Finally,
You want to come up here?
no, too many questions, I'm sorry. But the thing is, 2 weeks ago, I attended a conference with the EU on the nature of information in the European continent, how it's changing. We were told that the data indicated 70% of all information now consumed by the voters in Europe come from places like TikTok, not the mainstream. And they're regulating them is so far an impossible task. So how are we going to deal with information if that's the method of the future? Thank you very much.
Thank you. A lot of excellent questions. First, yes, I do believe that the Democrats, most of the Democrats who crossed over to support Trump are higher in authoritarianism, they're more conservative, less liberal, and they would be more likely than the Democrats who did not to exhibit the kinds of psychological characteristics that I have been talking about. So yes, some of these things are clearly operating among self-identified Democrats, that's for sure. And those people are the easiest ones for the Republicans to attract. Second question, there was a question about education. I spent a few hours looking for a really great, like the final word on the role of education and political orientation, and I really had a hard time finding it because there are a lot of conflicting papers out there. So at some point I might try to tackle that and synthesize it and write some kind of review article. But what the closest thing to a decent, solid conclusion I could find was that education tends to increase social liberalism, like an increased acceptance of where people go to the bathroom and things like this. But in some studies at least, it appears to have a conservative effect on economic issues, maybe because it's confounded with income, right? So, more highly educated people tend to be more wealthier, all things considered, and therefore they're also able to figure out what their self-interest is, and so on. So they might be against redistribution of resources and so on. But not every study finds that, and so on. So I'm not sure. That's the closest thing I could come to what's the overall picture, and I felt like it would a little bit distracted to go into the difference between social and economic issues. But lots of people in political science, as you know, have argued that one of the things, this is also a contentious claim though, that the Republicans have essentially gotten people's minds off the bread and butter economic issues and on these culture war issues, and that's part of their story of their success. That may be true. I know other political scientists who think that's not at all true, so I'm not sure. Elon Musk. Yes, a conservative plutocracy is exactly what I'm afraid of. In my remarks a few weeks ago at the American Academy of Political and Social Science, I did mention the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which, as you know, allowed way more money into our electoral process. And so, yes, that I would count those things as part of the macro, top-down structural story that's eroding, where our democracy is being eroded from the top down and the bottom up through this manipulation of things. Yeah. Was there something else that I missed? TikTok. Well, yeah, TikTok. I don't think the story is going to be that different than what I said about Twitter and Facebook, maybe even worse. But yeah, it can't be regulated if it's owned by China. It could be regulated if, as Congress is trying to force them to sell to Americans or something, then it could be regulated theoretically. But again, I think from what I understand, I don't understand that much about it, but I think the European Union is ahead of American government at regulating some of these things. And we have now a government that has no interest in regulating them because they benefit from misinformation.
I think we just go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. My pleasure, buddy.
Great contribution.